Hey everyone, so this week we're focusing on class reproduction and particularly thinking about social class in the US context. So, in the US, there's a lot of cultural and social discourses about how individuality matters for success. So, like it's all up to the individual to work hard and to achieve goals and to increase their income to move up into a different social class. And this discourse around individuality is used to actually create, maintain, and justify the class systems that are currently in place. Because if you just work hard, then you should be able to move your class position no problem, right? But that's not the case. And because we have this social concentration, thinking about the individual versus the structure, so how institutions matter, we don't ever really work for structural change to upend how our social class categories operate in the US. So we often don't create opportunities for low income people to move up in the world because there are these institutions that prevent people from doing so. And because we put the discourse puts the onus on the individual to succeed, we don't ever think about how systems impact individuals and make it difficult for them to reach higher than whatever social class they might be born into. So social inequality, especially class inequality, replicates across generations. And that's what we call social reproduction. It's reproduced by institutions such as the education system, which was discussed in the Huffington Post article. In the videos, they discussed capital and different types of capital and how that matters for social classes and how people engage in boundary work that constitute themselves and what their social class identity is, but also how they claim membership to a particular social class and to particular groups. So these forms of capital operate to create boundaries both for the individual and how they define themselves, but also how they fit within a larger social class context. So the first one that we think about is financial capital, which is pretty straightforward. It's basically money. But this money or financial capital is invested in different ways so that can increase individuals' financial standing. So other forms of financial capital might be home ownership. Having your own home and owning a home gives you financial capital that you can pass down to generations after you. And so this financial capital obviously is important because we live in a system where we need money to buy food, to buy homes, to buy cars, to go to college, like all of these different things. But it also helps us to increase other forms of other important forms of capital, such as social capital and cultural capital. So social capital are reliable or useful social networks that help provide opportunities for individuals. So these can be I think one of the best examples of social capital are like college and university alumni networks. So especially thinking about something like Greek life, oftentimes you need to have a certain amount of financial capital to be eligible to be in sororities and fraternities because you have to pay dues every year. So if you don't have that money, you can't join. But this Greek life offers social networks so that when young people graduate from college, they can access those networks and help them get jobs or find job opportunities. Similarly, there are social clubs at Ivy League institutions. When I was an undergrad, we read an article about how they operate, I think, at Harvard, where people join these groups or they're invited to join these groups. And then when they graduate, they're part of this huge network of people that typically have power and own businesses and are CEOs and can get them connected to jobs that otherwise, if you're not part of those groups, you don't have access to. So they put people at sort of an advantage in a lot of ways. The other important form of capital discussed in the readings is cultural capital. So cultural capital is really context specific because depending on the culture that you live in, different types of experiences and cultural products like art are going to be valued differently. So like different types of art. So some examples of high culture or cultural capital that belongs to like upper class wealthy people are things like going abroad, going to Europe, art, being able to go to museums like the Louvre in France, or going to the theater. So other forms of cultural capital that might be valued would be potentially graffiti, but we wouldn't necessarily think of that as being, excuse me, as being like a high class form of art, right? It's street art, and sometimes it's done by like gangs, for example. Other times it's individuals who are just engaging in art practices. So there's different types of graffiti, but it tends to not be heralded as high forms of culture. There are obviously exceptions to that. Banksy, for example, is really popular, but it's not what we would kind of traditionally think of when we think of art that people are going to spend a lot of money on. So depending on your context and what you value, cultural capital is going to matter differently. And actually, a lot of the original work done on these forms of capital was done by Pierre Bourdieu in France, and his focus was a lot on the education system and how cultural capital mattered for education inequality. So how wealthy young people were engaging in forms of art like opera and theater, and that was putting them at more of an advantage. Obviously, this is going to be context and time specific, so it's going to change over time what we value and what we see as important. So I think it's interesting and important to keep that in mind when we talk about capital. I mean, financial capital is pretty much always going to be the same. Money is money, and money will give people power. So these capitals sort of turbocharge social reproduction because parents are able to pass them down, so to speak, to their children in sort of the material ways. You can pass down a home. You can provide your children with expensive art items that you might own or pay for their college. So their parents are able to put their children at an advantage before they've ever entered an education system. And when we think about the education system, we think of it as this equalizer where people are able to move up in social classes and, have upward mobility. But actually, a lot of the time, education does not act like an equalizer, and instead it reinforces social stratification. Like the example I gave in Pierre Bourdieu's research, cultural capital made a huge difference in the educational experiences of wealthy students and put them at an automatic advantage over poor students. Similar things happen in the US. So while we think that a lot of these systems or institutions, I should say, like education, are going to help to create upward mobility for individuals, oftentimes they maintain wealthy individuals and then reproduce the inequalities that poor folks already face. So in the US context, there is a lot of social reproduction, but that doesn't necessarily mean that this idea of upward and downward mobility don't exist. It's just more difficult for people to be upward or downwardly mobile. So we think about the US as being a meritocratic system, which means everyone is on equal footing, and it matters how hard you work, and your intelligence and what you put in is what you get out. And so that's where a lot of these discourses around individuality come from. But in fact, we aren't actually a meritocracy. We just have cultural discourses of meritocracy. So we have examples where people are upwardly mobile. They're able to move up through education. They're given opportunities where colleges and universities maybe don't take into account SAT scores, which are typically putting poor people and people of color at a disadvantage. And so there are ways in which individuals are able to be upwardly mobile. And these stories, these pull yourself up by your bootstraps narratives, are what reinforce the class system, because they demonstrate how maybe some individuals, are able to do it. So why can't everyone? But in fact, it's very rare that is happening. It's more social reproduction than it is upward or downward mobility. And I think that this is really apparent in the Stuber reading, where she interviewed college students and talking about their social class experiences and how poor students tended to blame themselves, but they had more class consciousness, so they were aware of the class dynamics in a way that a lot of the wealthy students weren't. And so class identity becomes both economical and moral. So, on the one hand, obviously there's money involved. So, people that are poor have less money than rich folks, but there's also moral identity that gets wrapped up in social class identity. So, working class folks especially tend to have moral superiority around their work ethic and pinpoint how rich folks are lazy or don't work as hard and are like less good people because they don't have to work as hard. So the performance of someone's social class isn't just about how much money they spend and what they buy. It's also about the sort of performance they put on for the world. And so I also had you read some Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx. I assigned this reading because I think that it's important to read original writings, especially original sociological works. I still remember the first time that I read this. I think that it's interesting to put it side by side, something like the Stuber reading. So Karl Marx's reading is very theoretical, and it's not a study the way that Stuber's is. So it's sort of the theoretical backbone to how we think of a lot of stuff around social class in the US, but it doesn't necessarily reflect how we think about class, right? So reading through about bourgeoisie and the proletariats, it might seem a little bit foreign and like very sometimes unclear what's going on, but it's really important to think about how he's discussing power and conflict, so between the wealthy folks who are owning all of the means of production, so like factories, for example, and how they have power over the proletariats, the poor people who are working for them, who can only give up their bodies and their labor. They don't own anything. And so that's the basis of conflict theory, and it's really important in how we think about social class dynamics in the US. And for those of you who decide to be sociology majors, you'll definitely be reading Karl Marx more when you're in your required theory class. But I think that this is a good little foundation for any of you all moving forward in sociology or not moving forward. I think that it's important to read those original works, even if you don't want to be a sociologist and you don't want to be a Marxist. So remember, feel free to send me any emails with questions you might have about this week. I look forward to our meme discussions tomorrow. Have a good rest of your night.